Hey, Vanessa.
Hey, Tom.
Welcome to Uncertain Things.
The Uncertain Things podcast. Welcome.
Today we have Martin Gurri. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he needs introduction, but in case he does, he wrote the book Revolt of the Public.
If a book could be a spirit animal, then this would be the spirit animal of our podcast.
Even though you read it after we launched, which is interesting because he really brings together so many of the threads of cultural and social unrest, anxiety, and uncertainty, which is a word he used thematically in his book quite a lot.
Yeah, it gets italicized. It's important.
There are two interesting things to note about this book. First, it was written in 2014, and it's almost creepy to read it 6-7 years later. Should we call it prophetic?
I would, like, a lot of people who have interviewed Martin Gurri have started their interviews being like, what the hell? How did you know all of this so early on? Because it's basically like he's describing the Trump era, but years before it was on so many of our radars. So I think a lot of people do use these kind of like, you're such a prophetic figure, which I think he himself is like, no. I just had an interesting position from the CIA in which I was paying attention to what was happening in terms of media and information. And yeah, maybe I saw it a little bit first, but I definitely wasn't the only one. And if you were paying attention, you would have noticed.
Right, which brings us to the next fascinating point about his book, and again, why we find it so important. The perspective that informed his writing was from his experience as a media analyst for the CIA, which gave him a unique view on the power of media to change social and political and institutional behavior around the world. And a lot of those deep sea changes that we are experiencing and that we are trying to investigate here in certain things that seem to be affecting and destabilizing the basic ways that societies interact and understand themselves are, according to Gurri, rooted in the technological changes in modes of communication.
For me, I think also what's helpful is kind of his framing of this current moment as what's happening now is basically as seismic in its potential consequences as what has happened only a few other times in history. And he calls this the fifth wave. John, why don't you I think you know them better than me. Can you describe the four other waves just to kind of put it in perspective, like how pivotal this moment is in history?
Right. What he calls the waves are moments in human history where either cognitive or material changes have revolutionized the ways we communicate. So he counts the development of speech, and then writing, then the printing press, then mass media in the late 19th, early 20th century, and now the complete dispersion of communication through the internet and social media. Each of these revolutions ushered an age of chaos and an upending of existing institutions, as revolutions tend to do. And we're now living through one of those revolutions, which we are seeing clearly, because we are not interacting with the world the way we did growing up. Something is fundamentally changing.
Yes, something is changing, and he really diagnoses like a lot of the tension and unrest happening right now is because this more 21st century mode of communication and eventually society is still coming up quite violently against more 20th century conceptions of how we communicate and how we disseminate information and who gets authority and who doesn't, and so that's partly why we're in such a moment of unrest, because these two kind of mental conceptions are coming up against each other, and we are only in the beginning of trying to see the inklings of how it's going to settle out, if at all.
And I'll just add that we didn't even begin to scratch the surface of his book in this interview. So sure. I seriously commend you to go and get it, read it, and grapple with it. It's just so clarifying on so many things.
Right. He also, we start the conversation with this, but he brings in some really nice language from poetry, even though this is a work of prose. He brings in this kind of poetic language because sometimes it's that kind of language that really gets to the heart of how it feels to be living in this moment.
There's a lot of soul in his writing. Right.
Yes. If you're into uncertain things, which hopefully you are because you're listening, you're going to like this book. You just will.
Yes, that is true. And with that, make sure you follow us on all the things, on uncertainthing.substack.com. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media, which are the cause of our demise, apparently. And if you're not already, please subscribe and give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast, because that will be awesome.
Yep.
And with that,
Martin Gurri.
Well, one thing I did want to ask Martin, which doesn't have to be in the interview, but so one of our favorite poems that we've been turning to time and again, that is on brand for us, is The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. And I think it seemed like you must be a fan, just judging from the book titles and headers and things.
Yes. I'm always watching for creatures that are slouching towards Bethlehem to be born again.
Yeah, because I kept seeing like the language pop up again in the book,
Yes.
like center cannot hold, what beast, what rough beast, or whatever, you know.
The era of the rough beast too. You're right about that.
Completely.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite poems. I had several poems. I mean, I'm a big believer that what I do is kind of like, I don't know, you slap words together and try to make sense out of them. What poets do, they really explain. They truly do explain. So unfortunately, we live in a very prosy era. So it sounds very pretentious if you do that too much. Or if you can sneak in a phrase or two without the reader even knowing that they're getting poetry, I find that very, very wonderful.
well, I apologize. My computer is in disastrous shape, so it's slugging a little bit.
They do that.
Yeah.
The greater the complexity, the faster things start to fuck up.
A fantastic example of why everything fails.
Yes.
Martin Gurri, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, where should we start? I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation, as I said in the preparation. Your book, The Revolt of the Public, has unintentionally served as a retroactive Bible for uncertain things, in how it tries to explain the root causes of the sort of collapse of institutions and social norms that we see around us. So your big thesis, and correct me if I'm explaining it poorly, is that technological changes in the way we share information have had world-breaking consequences in changing the internal logic of our society, and that the new version, which we are now living through, seems to be one of ongoing, if not perpetual, instability. All while our institutions have failed to catch up with those changes.
That is exactly right. A simple way to look at it is that we have institutions of power, institutions of wealth, as you have been, I'm sure, reading the news, institutions of knowledge and entertainment that are basically legacy in their structures from the 20th century, which was, as you know, you probably don't know because you're a young man. I was there. I can tell you. All right. It was a very, very top-down time. Essentially, I talked, you listen. If I was a member of these institutions, and the idea that you might talk back to me was just not even in my mental horizon, right? So that is what we have inherited. There's a good reason for that. I'm not a conspiracy theory advocate. It was simply the way that it made perfect sense at that time to shape our institutions that way. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what side you take, or just as it happened, we have had this tremendous, what I call a tsunami of information that these institutions were simply not built to absorb. And it's as much the amount as it is the kind of information. Everybody is always pointing a finger at social media, but this all started long before social media had the sailings that it does right now. The second the internet became a thing, you could just start to see the seams open up in these countries and these institutions that were not used to being talked back. Now, of course, you have this circumstance where not only are we talking back, but there's this enormous roar of anger that talks back where you can barely hear the institutions anymore, who then become very demoralized. The elites that run those institutions are very demoralized and start to make stupid mistakes.
So when we're talking about information, we're talking about several things. First, we have the sheer amount of information, the fact that everybody can generate unthinkable amounts of information, share it with the rest of the world, and have access to it themselves. What's now a cliche to call the democratization of information. And the other aspect of it is the redundancy of it. The fact that information is being stored in several places, and it's very difficult for a government to just decide to take down something they don't like, because once you have a video uploaded on several social media sites, it's already diffused. These are the changes that we're talking about, right?
Right. If you want to be North Korea, fine. That's the dictator's dilemma, right? If you want to retain power, then you're going to have a wretched country, and every time you have a bad growing season, 500,000 people are going to die of hunger, right? Very few, even dictators, want to do that. They want prosperity, because what else is going to legitimize their rule? I mean, that's the Chinese model. If I give you 10% growth every year, how can you get rid of me, right? But to do that, you have to open up the market to information. When you do that, suddenly those voices start to come up that say, no, why are you doing this? And in most cases, it hasn't happened in China yet, but in most cases, you see this turbulence in the social and political environment that oftentimes results in these, very intense protests, and sometimes in dictators being overthrown and in elected governments being thrown out.
So before we get deeper into this, give us a chance to understand where you're coming from.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about your experience and how it informed your view on these issues.
If you want my way back origins, I was born in Cuba. Okay, so what that gives me is two things. I have a suspicion of governments that promise magnificent rewards, the Utopia. Deeply suspicious of that, and I believe that liberal democracy, at its worst, at its most dysfunctional, is superior to the most functional dictatorship. So those are the things I carried from my way back origins.
So you don't agree with that old Tom Friedmanian argument that, well, China at least got things done.
No, well, I mean, China got things done to the degree that it opened up its society.
Yeah, so just in preparation for this interview, I re-encountered that old piece of his, and it shocks me every time anew. It's just there's something almost venal about that kind of logic.
It's an absurd justifier. I mean, Tom Friedman, who of course I don't think anybody reads anymore, would never lived under those conditions. He would never allow himself to be told, these are the boundaries within which you are allowed to write your columns. So why he would think that the rest of us would want to do that, or anybody, including the Chinese public, would want to do that, is a deep mystery to me. But I was an analyst for many years at CIA of global media. So I always say that I had probably the least sexy job in CIA, right? I mean, I did not have a license to kill. But as luck would have it, I was situated in a place where I could see, I had this is global coverage of media, global translation of the language I didn't know. So I had these inputs coming to me. I was at this high place, let's put it that way, and I could see really, really far into this change. Early in in my career in the 20th century, the job had been very straightforward. The amount of open information was a trickle. The president said, what's the media saying about my policies in France? Well, there were two newspapers we were going to go to, and 90% of them you didn't pay attention to the actual body of the newspaper. So it was a trickle. Suddenly, around the turn of the century, we have this tsunami that I write about. And I think a lot of the credit I get is misplaced. I think I was in a high place, and I could see that far out. And I wasn't alone. That many of us who were there saw that. I was the one who was fascinated enough that once I left government, I pursued it. And things happened like the Arab Spring. I mean, basically, the 20 teens happened. The 20 teens are like a pulse of street revolts and populists that peak in 2019, right before everything gets shut down by the pandemic. Okay, with I counted at least 25 major street insurgencies. So I was very lucky to be able to have seen that in advance. And I asked myself the question. I mean, it's remarkable when I look back. Okay, the internet was there, the information was there, and the question was, when we were inside the CIA, say, well, look, behind this tsunami, there is this ever increasing level of political and social turbulence. And people would ask the question, and we honestly didn't have an answer. Well, what the heck does an information device, the internet, have to do with politics? I mean, that actually could be asked back then, right? And that seemed like a silly question. So that was the question I posed myself. What does information have to do with politics? That really is the seed out of which that book grew. And the information, I mean, the data, the research that I gathered began with the fact that I could see that this was coming a long time before other people did. Not because I'm that much smarter than everybody else, but because I was in that high place. I could see that much farther out.
And I think the thing that you get credit for, I think most justifiably, is that you not only that I guess that you asked that question, and you were able to pull in those threads and recognize that a lot of people said at the time during the Arab Spring, which we are now essentially marking the 10-year anniversary of.
Yeah.
People were saying that Twitter propelled it, or the Twitter revolution, or the Facebook revolution of the time. So people were aware that those new modes of communicating information were essential to enabling these movements. But what you did was so much more profound in that you thought not just how it facilitates interactions which most people took as echoes of old modes of communication, basically a change of quantity, not quality. But you recognize that the modes of communication were now informing the interactions themselves and the way that the governments were responding to these interactions. The medium is the message, so to speak. So to understand how this change came into being, we need to go back into what you discuss as the old industrial societies, in the relics of which we still live. So what do you see as the defining features of industrial societies that got disrupted by this change?
Yeah, and unfortunately it has not changed enough. They are, well, I mean, I can tell you because I lived in one such institution, CIA. They are top-down. Everything happens in a hierarchical fashion. That means that they are incredibly slow-moving. That means that nothing gets done until all the major powers that be in the hierarchy agree that they're not going to be losing out by what happens next, all right? And then when they turn to the public, in the old days, in the 20th century, which you weren't there, they would talk to the public from authority. In other words, I wasn't trying to tell you, Adam, let's talk about this. This is what I think. Tell me, feed me back your ideas. No. I have the information. You're just sitting there. You have no information. You have as much information as I tell you. So you're going to look to me as a valuable source and as a figure of authority. And they told the public certainly what were the important issues, important public issues that she was paying attention to, and oftentimes, not infrequently, how to think about these issues. Once that tsunami hits, of course, that entire model, you need a semi-monopoly over information to be able to maintain that authority.
You also bring up this idea of choice, right? Like the choices were so limited, and that helped imbue the authority that the two newspapers had, or the whatever it was.
No, it's totally true. I mean, I honestly believe. I mean, one of my fascinations in talking to younger people, who's almost everybody than me, right? But younger people like yourselves, is that I am speaking it to you across an incredible gulf. You can form no idea what the tiny amount of choice was that I had when I was a young man. I mean, you would have to be vastly imaginative to almost a science fiction world compared to what we have today. And in that science fiction world, those who had any kind of information, of course, the government had it, the media had it, the universities had it, business had it. There were certain big institutions that had their pot of information in a semi-monopolistic way. They had tremendous authority. And so they spoke truth. I mean, what is truth? That's the question that Pontius Pilate asked. And then I think he walked out of the room before anybody could answer, which is probably not a bad idea. Basically, we tend to think of truth as either some kind of Platonic form or a gift from science or something along those lines. Truth essentially is some story that we're told by a person whom we trust, or a figure that institutional figure that we trust. And once the semi-monopolies of information are gone, that authority is gone, and truth becomes up for grabs. What you see today, of course, is there are 20 takes on every situation, and part of the elite mindset today is that they believe they own the truth, and that is just palpably, a mistake, because they think in a Platonic sense that they have, or a scientific sense, I'm sure they would think of it, that they have arrived at something that is unshakable, and you need to listen. And anybody, if you're an anti-vaxxer, you're probably kind of a crazy person, and this slides real quick into craziness, because once the lid is off, once there is no authority, what's to stop the craziness from happening, right? But there are many other aspects of our political play, a political story that can be seen from many different directions and look very different depending on where you're standing.
So one of the features that you point out of industrial societies, which they used in order to maintain their top-down order, is bureaucratization, right? It was a way that allowed a government to manage an increasingly growing workforce and maintain efficiency. As a result, the system started believing in its own perfectibility, that this way of organizing society, which may have been right for a certain moment in history, is the blueprint for human prosperity and well-being. If you come across a problem, just form a new government office with its own hierarchy of experts, and they'll look into it. At which point, we're just a few tweaks away from perfect and the apex of human flourishing. Now, what you point out is that as the failures of big state to deliver on these big promises became more clear to the elites running those governments, they became more timid. They grew timid about actually implementing big projects, and instead started pursuing small, almost trivial tasks without actually foregoing the rhetoric of architecting a perfect society. But once we have a revolution of information, this dissonance becomes clear for everyone to see.
Yeah, I honestly believe, Adam, that Utopia was front and center for every system, every political system, practically to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then after that, it became almost implied, but it became less explicit because the conflict wasn't there. And then, of course, around the turn of the century, it began to disintegrate. But Utopia was always there. The idea was, if you could apply enough political power, and that depended on the system. If you were the Soviet Union, you could kill hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions to get there. If you're in the United States, you just spent a lot of money and disrupted a lot of people. But if you apply enough political power and enough scientific thinking, because science is kind of like the god of this outlook, you could achieve utopia. You could cure the human condition. And the political rhetoric that evolved in that time was shaped around that. Vote for me, I will end unemployment. Vote for me, I will end inequality. And what has happened, I think, that is very dysfunctional is that, as you say, the institutions no longer have this great ambition. The failures always far outstrip the successes. But if you have a semi-monopoly over information, it doesn't matter. You're sort of judged on your ambition rather than your outcomes, right? But now you're being judged on your outcomes, and you're mostly failing. So you're going to try less. I mean, nobody could build Hoover Dam today. Everybody brags about Hoover Dam being the government. Nobody could build it today. You couldn't get past all the hoops to build it, right? So the government has become far more timid and palpably so, and the elites far more demoralized, but the political rhetoric is still the same. So to get elected president, you have to promise things that are almost utopian, and that the second you're in office are going to start eroding the people's trust in you, because you can't possibly get there. You're not going to, the president of the United States is not going to get us into utopia.
So where does the information revolution comes in?
Well, I mean, I think once you have that information out there, you are, it's like, the Constitutional Convention was a closed enterprise. They did not let anybody in. There were no reporters there. There was just these very brilliant people putting together the structures that were going to govern our country for the next, 250 years. If you had opened that up and brought in, all the web reporters and all the normal media, and I mean, you couldn't have done it. You simply could. You would have been a lot more timid. You would have played to the audience. This is what Yuval Levin, I don't know if you know about him and his book, talks about our performative elites. Well, when these institutions suddenly become like theaters in the round because everybody can see deep into them that used to be closed, the temptation is overwhelming to play to the audience and to basically play for applause rather than achievement. And I think that's what happens. You have people playing for applause rather than achievement, so nothing gets done. But meanwhile, the rhetoric is sustained. You're still talking, I can cure inflation. There's absolutely no, if you read a book by Paul Ormerod, Why Things Fail, he, to my satisfaction, explains how we don't really have a lot of knowledge long-term how to bring down inflation, unemployment. You can spend a lot of money and you get a little pump out of that. It's like a shot of adrenaline in the arm. But when that adrenaline is over, you kind of go like, well, we're back to where we started, a little bit worse. So the promises that are made are utopian still. And we, as the public, expect them of our politicians. I mean, in the end, I'm not blaming our politicians. I'm blaming the electorate, us, because we expect them. Somebody says, well, I'm going to try this, but we are not sure that it's going to work. And if it doesn't try, we're going to keep doing trial and error until we get there. That person will never get elected. Never, not once. That's what we need, though. That's the rhetoric we need. We need humility and we need honesty. And what you have now is essentially promises that can't be met.
I feel like we should probably get into the information, the fifth wave here. We've kind of briefly touched on this before, but let's start fleshing it out a bit more. And one of the things that I think is interesting is the ways that people interpret what's happening to society because of technology has definitely gone through different interpretations, right? Like with the Arab Spring, maybe a lot of people were like, wow, it's amazing. Technology is going to change the world in a positive way. And now we're in a moment of profound tech clash where people are like, this technology, it's the end of everything. And we recently had a conversation with journalist Matt Welch, and he was saying, I think it's overblown. How many times have we introduced a new technology to society and everybody thinks it's the end of the world? Like zippers were the end of the world, and it was all overblown. We just needed time to adapt to this new technology. And so he was kind of putting forth that theory that we're overthinking this technology thing. But I just keep having the sensation that there's something quite fundamentally different occurring now, and we don't have to put it into social media. But I think what your book kind of uncovers is, yes, there is something fundamentally different happening about the kinds of technologies and the ways that they're disseminating information. So would you mind potentially kind of explaining why this isn't just something we've seen before?
Oh, we've seen it before.
Okay.
We have seen it before. And possibly the most disruptive instance in history was the invention of the printing press, which, of course, it's had a longer run, a much longer run than the web. But the things that it brought, good and horrible, are on a level beyond anything that's happening now. Okay, essentially, without the printing press, you wouldn't have had the French Revolution, the American Revolution, or the Scientific Revolution. All right. On the other hand, so that sounds great, though, very positive. You would have had difficulty having the 30 Years' War, which was the most horrific war in Europe up until that time, in which millions died. Germany was depopulated for generations. And the cause for that war was essentially that religious groups, differed in about 10 different words in their beliefs. But the words were right there in those books, all right? And they all walked out with their books. And the people who didn't have those words were to be exterminated. And my friend Antonio Garcia Martinez, I don't know if you know who he is, but I always recommend him as the smartest man on Twitter, fellow Cuban. He says, if you had gone to Germany in the 30 Years' War, and you had asked, well, what do you think? What do you think of the printing press? People would have said it is the most horrific and destructive new technology that has ever been invented. So we're in the very early days of the web. I always say that we are in the very beginnings of a colossal transformation. This is not zippers. This is not zippers. We're in the very beginnings of a colossal transformation from the industrial age of the 20th century to something that honestly doesn't even have a name, okay? So we are now on a long march to somewhere that we're not even sure where that is. The one thing that is pretty certain is that we are not going back. I think part of the conflict today is this deep-seated nostalgia that the elites have for the 20th century, which is a good time for them. Nobody's going back. And therefore, an unwillingness to see how these institutions can be reshaped, reconfigured around the digital technology.
I think Vanessa's discomfort with Matt's I don't want to say overconfidence, but with Matt's position on this is not whether or not we saw something like this before, but the idea that we had revolutions in the past doesn't mean that we will necessarily survive them. It almost reeks of survivor's bias. From this side of the revolution, we can unequivocally cheer and say, we definitely rather live now than before Gutenberg. But, there were 500 years of tumult and intervening, and we're just at the beginning of this revolution. Who the hell knows what's waiting for us on the other side and when?
That's exactly my position. I think it is a matter of time. I think, of course, we will adapt. I think there will be a new form of authority at some point that takes into account all the tricks of the digital environment. The question for me is liberal democracy going to be there when that happens?
And this is one of the reasons I really quite connected with your book. You have a horse in this race, and it's your concern for the survival of liberal democracy. So to go a step further into your analysis, you've borrowed a framework that helped you understand this change in power relations. Specifically, you use two terms, border and center. Can you explain them?
Yeah, these are sociological terms. I have a very terrible memory, so I can't bring up the authors of the book where I derive them from. But essentially, every society has a center. The center has many of the qualities that we described for the 20th century. It's centralized, it's administrative, it's standardized, it's top down, it it is obsessed with rank, and everybody's always bowing to everybody else. It moves slowly. It is always being surprised by events because it lives in this world where the information is held very tightly by a few people. The border, on the other hand, is wild, right? And it's sectarian, and it is egalitarian to a fault. All right. So when I read that book, the thing that struck me as amazing was that they were describing. This book was written in the 70s, the 80s, I think. It described the web culture perfectly. It was egalitarian to a fault, a sectarian, and they were thinking of it in terms of two sects. You basically have to agree about everything, and you don't have ideologies, you don't have leaders, you have a modeling of virtue. You and your person model virtue, and if there are any disagreements, things splinter. You go form out your own little sect, right? And so it's an endless splinter, but there's enormous energy in this because these are people who are true believers. These are people who have a sense of the evil of the center. Anything the center does, I mean, basically the border exists to attack the center and to counteract it. They believe that everything that happens in the center is corrupt, and everything that happens in the center is self-serving, and to be a free individual and to be a person of dignity, you have to assert your own way of being, and you can only do that with a tiny little group of people. The difference with the web is suddenly real sects have to be small. The sectarian mind in the digital universe exploded in dimension. Suddenly it scaled. It scaled amazingly. So you can think of the web culture as a sectarian mind at scale. And basically what we have today is the seeping of the sectarian approach into our politics. I mean, I think both Obama and Trump were deeply sectarian politicians.
We are now at a point where we are starting to see more border behavior infiltrating the center. And again, you describe how the border is this force of destruction and protest, but that it doesn't really have the desire or power to organize as a governing force. Now, we've just had 4 years of Trump, which is a clear manifestation of this type of border mentality. But you show in your book and make a very elucidating case, I think, for me, and you wrote the book in 2014, how Obama was already an early version of that. Because especially after he lost Congress and was reelected, he seemed to have focused more time and effort in broadcasting his solidarity with the anger of the border, with this constant frustration, and show that he's part of the protest against the center to which he now belonged. And I wonder if you see something similar with some of the reactions of Republicans to the riots on January 6th. Aren't they also trying to channel the rage and anarchy of the border, but from inside government?
I would disagree with that. I think they're just afraid and demoralized. And by the way, you can make the same claim, for example, of all the Democratic mayors in the cities that had violent protests and riots, who did the same thing. They just basically, I mean, the poor mayor of Portland tried to join the protest. Of course, he was hooted out. He didn't realize he was an elite. He thought he was going to be one of the good guys, But they are very afraid and very demoralized, and they feel like they're not on the winning side of history. And of course, they don't know what to do. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have the 20th century, man, it's great at the top. I can just talk and talk and talk, and nobody contradicts me. But they also want, obviously, they're politicians. They want to be able to project themselves into the future, and they see this tsunami, coming at them. And so
you're saying they're not genuinely channeling the border, they're just caving to it because they feel powerless.
I think there are many different, that depends on the individuals, obviously. But I think as a rule, I would say I would define our elite class as primarily wedded to 20th century behaviors, and yet completely demoralized about how successful those behaviors are going to be politically. So they're they're just paralyzed. They're paralyzed. You can see it in their eyes, you know. I mean, one of my favorite quotes of all time was Andrew Cuomo, after basically the Black Lives Matter protests had taken out Midtown Manhattan. And he said, you don't have to protest anymore. You don't have to protest anymore. These, of course, were the sectarians in the street. He said, you've won. He said it twice. You won. You won. You don't have to protest anymore. You can get what you want. And they pause and he goes, what do you want? You know? And that, of course, is the frightening thing to the elites, is if you are confronting a sectarian revolt based on negation, no policy is going to appease them. There has been no many times. The Cuomo's example is, I can multiply that for you. Many times where governments that were under these protests yielded and said, okay, we yield. Whatever you protesters want, we will give you. And of course, the protesters, they just said, well, that's not good. That nothing you can do is going to satisfy me. And so they went around and around. That was back there. It was when Black Lives Matter, basically, they just had a fairly violent and destructive episode in Midtown Manhattan. And he was trying to basically tell them that he was sympathetic to them. But he didn't know what he was being sympathetic to. So he was asking, well, what do you want? What are you doing all this for? And the answer is we want to bash at you. We want to take you down. Sectarians,
Right.
The sectarian mindset would consider itself polluted, impure, if it struck any deal with the center. And so it's a pretty terrible dynamic.
I do think it's just it is worth just sitting on that for a second, because this idea of the public or the protesters being defined by negation and not being for anything is actually, I think, it sounds really straightforward, but I think it is actually quite profound. Like, when you ask these crowds, right, like, what is your alternative? What are you suggesting? What do we work towards? There is no answer, because the only unifying force is what we don't want, right? And then how do you move forward when the whole energy is bound up in negation?
And that is not to say that some of the people involved in this protest don't have a very clear vision of what kind of world they want to bring about. But as a movement, they don't really have a program for governing.
Right. And I mean, there are as many policies being put forward, I would guess, as there are individuals that go out there. That is the sectarian way. Is that I'm not following a leader. I'm following my own impulse, my own conscience, and going out there. I mean, it's a painful process, but as part of my research, you can find hours of young people talking on YouTube, for example, in the Seattle and the Portland autonomous zones, right? And they talk endlessly. Of course, these are young people. They have a lot to say, they think. And they have, of course, the devices to essentially their video selfies. And you can listen for hours and not come across a single concrete demand. In other words, we must change X, Y, or Z, or else we'll do whatever. But what you hear a lot is a kind of a pride in modeling a virtuous behavior. Look, here we are, this autonomous zone. People are coming in and bringing us water and food, and we're all treating each other as like brothers and sisters, and I'm part of this. And so it's kind of the sectarian mind is moralistic, it's not political. And it seeks kind of like an internal revolution, not a political revolution. And these young people are putting themselves forward as models, but that's as far as it goes. You cannot, once you have a leader, then it's kind of like, no, who made you a leader? Why are you better than me? And the problem is, of course, I always say, I think our institutions are hierarchical to a ridiculous degree. I think you needed to do that in the 20th century. You don't have to do that in the 21st, but you need a hierarchy. You need a hierarchy to get anything done. I don't know how else you get it done other than by some sort of arrangement where somebody is coming together and saying, this is what needs to be done. And somebody goes, okay, I'll help you do it. And you can't do it voluntarily because, then that's a point of failure.
So you wrote the book in 2014, and a lot of the story comes in from 2011, right? It's kind of like tipping point year, this momentous year, and you kind of go through the
Phase
different
change.
yeah, that you go through the different movements that emerge, and you describe, the things that are the through lines kind of between them. I mean, I would probably posit that 2020 was a similarly explosive year potentially. And I mean, we saw waves of different types of protests. I'm thinking in Chile and Hong Kong and the US. Do you see a through line between 2011 through 2020, or do you think that it's evolving or changing in some way?
It was 2019. So 2019, I think I told you, was the cusp of that cycle of revolts. It was crazy. I mean, that's supposed to be the thing I do. I couldn't keep up. I had no idea. Somebody would tweet me, go, "Oh, Gurri, you need to look at this." And we're like, "What the hell is this?" I mean, I have no idea. Every day there seemed to be a different one. And it happened in poor countries. I mean, like Sudan. It happened in rich countries like France. It happened in dictatorships like Algeria. And it happened in, really sound and strong democracies like Chile's. So it had nothing to do necessarily with economic deprivation, or at least not mainly about that, not only about that. And it wasn't necessarily a cry for democracy. It was this sense that modern government, as it is currently structured, it needs to be changed, needs to be negated, all right? And that's what drove these revolts in all these countries. I mean, Hong Kong and so many different places. So it's the same thing. It's the identical same thing. You see the behaviors. They're exactly the same thing, and the same thing that you saw in Black Lives Matter as well. There are no leaders. There are no serious structures. They're little groups, but they are web-type groups, very loose and very unhierarchical. There is no ideology. There's vague flavors, so you can be vaguely right-wing, like the Yellow Vests in France, or you can be vaguely left-wing, like the Indignados in Spain, but that's vague. Okay, it's really vague, and they do not assert that. They don't call themselves those things. So there are no leaders. There's no proposals. In France, the president gave the Yellow Vests everything they wanted. It wasn't good enough. The public never takes yes for an answer. Basically, their demands are systemic and negative. So no positive policy is going to satisfy them.
I would argue that, at least for Black Lives Matter, that there is the inciting incidents are much more well defined, and the structures that they're fighting against are more well defined than, say, Antifa, which is an organization of pure negation. They were already protesting Biden on the eve of his inauguration. And maybe it's because Black Lives Matter has a different tradition to draw on of the history of the civil rights movement that does ground it in more 20th century type of protests, to some extent at least.
Couldn't disagree more. I think the Black Lives Matter protests connect to the Indignados and the Yellow Vests far more than they would to, say, the kinds of moral crusades that Martin Luther King espoused. I mean, the civil rights movement, again, believe it or not, I was alive for that time. I was really young. The civil rights movement was about equalizing a very unjust and long-running circumstance. Black Lives Matter. You say that the triggering episode. I almost hesitate to say it because that's so, I take it for granted. The triggering episode. One of the few things I actually know a little bit about is visual persuasion, visual analysis. I've actually introduced that at the CIA. I mean, the thing you know about visual analysis, there's a gigantic background story that you're not privy to. So your first thing you need to do is that, okay? And so you're seeing something, and that something is being communicated very powerfully, because visuals are powerful. They go into your reptile brain, and all your training in, no, I'm fighting a rhetoric, I know I'm being led in a certain direction, is gone, because your reptile brain just reacts. And so All I'm saying is it could very well have been that this cop that was responsible for the death just hated black people or hated this particular black person, George Floyd. But you can offer other explanations. The reason it exploded was because there was a group online that was, every time this kind of a thing happened where the cops would kill or harm a black person, they would push forward. And at a certain moment, these things break loose, and they break loose in random ways. I always compare them to, why do stories or memes go viral online? And there are all kinds of analysis about this, and they give you all the qualities you have to have, and all those qualities tend to be there for all the viral stories. But then there are millions of other stories that have those qualities and don't go viral. So to me, there's some random element involved in all these protests, not just Black Lives Matter, all of them. Why did they happen when they happened? It's sort of a random anger that a particular moment. Same thing happened in France with the Yellow Vests. They had what they called anger groups on Facebook, Groupe de Colère, where they basically yelled. For a year, they were sitting there yelling about Macron, and then they passed this, I think it was like 5-cent tax on diesel fuel, or 10-cent tax, and the whole thing exploded. I mean, it was a completely disproportionate response to what was happening. That was not the cause. I don't think George Floyd was the cause. I don't think that the tax was the cause. There was this anger. There was this sectarian rage and need for negation. And at some random moment, some aligning of the moons and the stars, this thing goes viral, and people are on the streets by sometimes in the millions.
Right. And the thing that makes your argument so persuasive is that it's not coincidence that we're now seeing this worldwide eruption of dissatisfaction. Like whether it's Antifa or QAnon or previously the Arab Spring and the Green Revolution in Iran, or the Indignados. And obviously these groups don't have the same moral valence, in my view. But there is something that is propelling this mood.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there is a misalignment between all these institutions and the way the public lives. I mean, it's that simple. I think you can get a car, a house, a spouse by a click of the mouse, right? At the speed of light, I could get myself a spouse. I'm married already, so it's not going to happen. But if I wanted to, I could. All right. But then you want to get yourself a passport, and it's like 6 weeks. You want to get yourself a building permit, it's probably 10 years or 6 years or whatever, right? You are suddenly in the world of the 20th century where these things move, in a creeping way. And there is a sense, and I don't think we can discuss it, but I don't think it's necessarily false, that all those obstacles and procedures don't exist for the people at the top. They can sail through. I always watched with great amazement, having lived in the CIA, where if I had done the slightest thing inappropriate with obviously classified materials, my butt would have landed in jail. And several people that I know of who were high government officials of different administrations, walked home with them, for example, and were kind of rapped on the knuckles and said, well, you can't have this job anymore. But nobody ended in prison. And I think that was then, it's perceived to be way worse now. The idea that, there's all these things, there's this tremendous paralysis of government. I want to get something done and government gets in my way rather than help me out. But that's not true for them. Government seems to work for them, because they get a lot out of it and they get to rule over the rest of us. So I think the anger is based on that. There's an element of truth.
And your argument even goes deeper, because when it comes to protests in liberal democracies, especially among the more prosperous classes, at least with some of them, there is an element of social psychology almost. Because we're not talking about people who are oppressed in the way that the Iranians are, or people under Mubarak or Sisi are. So you observe that many of these protests are of young, affluent people who are looking for government to fill something in their hearts that's missing. They expect government to be able to fix everything, including the ineffable vacancies in their lives. And it's the government's failure to do that that really enrages them.
Exactly. I mean, I think that the anger is explicit about political and social issues, but unstated and probably originates not in political questions, but in existential questions. I think we're dealing with a generation. Most of this is young millennials and Zoomers, okay, out in the street. And you're dealing with a generation where religion, formal religion is very minimal, and community is not what it used to be, where you had these very structured organizations that your family would be in. Even the family is not what it used to be when you look at the numbers of homes where there's either not a mother or not a father, and so the places that gave you what human beings desire the most once they know they're not going to starve to death, which is meaning. All right. Now, the first thing is I have to feed myself and my family. Second thing is, why am I here? They're trying to derive meaning from politics. That's a little bit of what I was talking about with those young people in the autonomous zones who were so proud to be modeling those behaviors. That was, you could just see that there was meaning. And the trouble with that is, why would you want to stop that? The second you stop your protest, no matter what they gave you, you would lose that meaning. And yeah, that was very, very striking in Israel, because the people who were doing this is not unusual in these protests. The people who were doing the protesting were probably the most affluent people in Israel. None of the poor people, none of the poorest or the most marginalized people ever participated in any large numbers.
One of the points that you make in the book is that this isn't going to wrap up anytime soon. This period of instability. Is your point that we can't really reach an equilibrium point because both sides are so antithetical to each other?
Well, I mean, like I said before, I think sooner or later there will be some sort of adaptation to this tremendous change by the institutions. My guess, and as you probably know from the book, I don't really make predictions. Prediction was a CIA business model. And what I say is that as long as tomorrow looks like yesterday, which is most of the time, you do great. But the second it deviates from that, which is when you really want to know, you do terrible. My sense of it is, and this is just a sense, a gut sense, a speculation, is that I'm not going to see the end of it. You may not see the end of it, but you might. This is going to go on for a while. This is the equivalent of the printing press. The printing press took a long, long time to work out all its permutations. I mean, imagine all those enlightened despots all over Europe who suddenly felt like, why are they reading these books? How do we keep them out? The idea of censorship didn't exist until the printing press, because there weren't enough books and there weren't enough literate people. So basically, we are at the beginnings of that. I am, and this is just temperament, short-term pessimist, long-term optimist. Why couldn't we? Why couldn't we work this out? I mean, in essence, that's what happened in the 20th century. The United States, before that divide of the progressive era, was a lot, more closer to the ground. The institutions were flatter. I mean, if you ever read about Teddy Roosevelt, his second inaugural, the president stood out there in front of the White House shaking hands with anybody who came. And Teddy Roosevelt was famous because he was this epic physical specimen. And he would literally shake hands for like 10 hours, right? And thousands of people. But there was the president in front of the White House shaking hands. Could you do that today? I mean, of course you couldn't. So, but what happened was that was a flat form of government that was very wonderful if you happened to be, a gentleman. I mean, it was essentially a gentleman's republic. And then you had these millions of people who entered history in the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century, and they had to be organized somehow. And there were mass movements that were organized, and they were very hierarchical, very structured. And the industrial model, happened to be just there to be borrowed from. So that idea was that, scientific management, we have scientific government. So we changed once already. So this is not like the government of the United States is the way it was back, when the Constitution first was put into effect. There's no reason why we can't do it again peacefully.
I want to give you a chance to comment on recent events. I mentioned the Capitol riot. It's the epic closure of the Trump presidency. It's ended the way it was always bound to. What's your assessment of the past 4 or 5 years?
I mean, I think the Trump years were extreme sectarianism in power. I think Trump was elected, and I'll give you my interpretation of Trump, which I find the elites absolutely disagree with. And unfortunately for me, I mean, when you talk to the public, right? I mean, there's a great thing about a podcast is you actually get to talk to a normal person. But I mean, so I spend a lot of time amongst the elites, and they all think I'm half crazy. But they think of Trump as this master manipulator that pull the thread with fake news and make the public seem like up was down and white was black, and therefore bamboozle people into following him. My theory is the exact opposite. My theory is that you had this angry public that wanted to bash at the institutions. And how do you decide? I mean, basically, what it wanted was somebody to stand up and say, "I'm the man." The mainstream politics, the elite politics, refused to give the public that option. So the idea of a polite, normal rebel against the system was canceled. So the public looked for somebody who was totally weird, who sounded completely not like all the talking heads in Capitol Hill and the White House and so forth, and thought, well, this guy is our man. He is the club that I'm going to use to smash at these institutions. And Trump was very good at being a club. Of course, you're smashing at the institutions you happen to be presiding over. That may not be the most productive thing in the world to do. So that is my take on the Trump years. I would say this: the people who opposed Trump were equally as destructive and equally as crazy and bizarre. I mean, I think his great talent was to make his opponents be just as nutty as he was, okay? So I think it took two to tangle on that one, and that the Trump years were, that was the theater that you saw. One side going crazy and the other side even worse.
How do you mean? I mean, obviously, in the sense that he knew how to play the game of sectarianism. You definitely need to give him credit that he spoke that language. As people have mentioned, he was essentially an internet troll, which is just another word to say he's a border sectarian, and knows how to galvanize his own side and knows how to incite the other and benefit from it. So I will certainly acknowledge that he provoked a lot of crazed responses, sometimes disproportional from his opponents. But how do you mean that they were as destructive?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you read my my essay that I just published in the City Journal, but that's essentially the descent of the New York Times into what Andre Mir, a media scholar that I respect a lot, calls post-journalism. And I don't want to get into that too much, but I'll give you one example. Okay, the New York Times had possibly, I mean, it's difficult to measure, but as far as I could figure out, over 3,000 pieces, articles that were published on the Trump-Russia conspiracy, all right, during the Mueller years. So the entire New York Times newsroom was reorganized for that single story. Practically, I mean, I think virtually every story had Trump being guilty of something. Virtually every day in the New York Times was the end of Trump. And at the end of that 2-year process, Mueller comes out and says there's absolutely no evidence that anybody in the United States conspired with Russia. Okay, so you had 2 years of the most respected newspaper in the world, probably, dedicating itself to a story that wasn't there, okay, because they hated Trump so much. And for other reasons that you can find, there's actually a business incentive for that, which you can read in my essay. But the point is, they looked on Trump as Trump looked as the institutions, and they were perfectly willing to bash, impeach or try to impeach over every possible way to get rid of him, which communicated to his people that, well, whenever we elect somebody, it's never legitimate. There were people on the streets the day he got elected. There were 1 million people in the streets of Washington the day after inauguration. He hadn't done a thing. He had not lifted a finger. So there was a sense that he was not legitimate from the beginning. And people, institutions like the New York Times treated him as not legitimate from the beginning. So I think both sides bear the blame. Trump gets blamed out in the open. He was the president and should have been, but also all the articulate institutions of the United States turned on him. So, they have a loud voice. We heard that. But the other side was equally irresponsible, I think.
I would agree that sectarianism existed in both sides, but but there are different types and different forms, and I do think that I mean, I don't want to get into this argument because I think it will derail us, but I have a small pushback there, which I'll just register. More interestingly, I wonder how do you see this tango in terms of your scheme? Is that just because everything is now sectarian because there is no more no.
I think those are not sectarians. I think Trump represented some very powerful sectarian forces. I think the rest is what I would call a reactionary movement. People whose ideal are somewhere in the 20th century. They want to basically move the world back to the past. And I think most of the people that opposed Trump were institutional actors. I mean, that I'm talking about here, were institutional actors, were elites, and were driven crazy by Trump. I mean, they did and said crazy things, and in the process, did their own little bashing at the institutions. They probably didn't mean to. That wasn't their aim. They were aiming at Trump. But Trump was the president, whether they liked it or not. And they pretty much said, no, he's not. Okay. And so I think there was a lot of destructiveness.
So it was the dissonance of having a border character at the center.
An extreme border character with a weird personality, which I don't think is necessary, right? So, I mean, all kinds of things that you can say about Trump. Yes. And I think the election of Joe Biden is a fascinating inflection point, right? I mean, this guy is the 20th century all over. I mean, and the thing about him is he's totally boring and totally mediocre, right? I mean, this is a man he's been a politician for forever. I think was in the Senate for like 36 years. He was perfectly honorable service, but didn't achieve much, and ran for president twice, and flared out each time pretty early on. He represents the old ways. He represents the victory of those elites who wanted, basically to restore the 20th century. It may be, by the way, I mean, this is just a personal judgment, that maybe what we need for the next 4 years is boring. I mean, it would be kind of sweet, wouldn't it?
But not only that, but in the context of the COVID pandemic, like, no matter how much you want to rail against the establishment, I am currently, craving science to lead a response that is centralized and coordinated in order to approach a public health emergency. And so I could imagine there being some sort of reversion back to some desire of this 20th century mindset, at least in this moment of unprecedented difficulty.
Well, you're not the only one who's told me that. I mean, I'm watching. I think the great question nobody's asking right now, right, is at some point, guess what? We're all going to get vaccinated. At some point, this great public that in 2019 was in absolute crazy revolt mode is going to go back out into the streets. The great question nobody's asking is, what's it going to want to do, right? And I have the person that I have worked with, let's say, I've run across David Goodhart, a British writer, who told me it's going to be the hour of the state. I mean, we basically have been, told to go home and wash our hands, and we went home and washed our hands, and we've been kind of taught to obey, and that could be what you gave me another possibility. A second possibility is going to be, it may be their roaring 2020s. I tell you, I'm halfway there. I mean, if I can go get vaccinated and I'm old enough that I'm going to be early on, I don't want to go out there and party, man. I mean, it's like I've been stuck at home too long. People are going to want to go to work. They want to make money. They want to get married. They want to raise children. All the things that have been put on delay, they want to go out there and do social things mostly, though. And politics may be allowed, yeah, whatever. If you look at the original roaring 20s, basically, you had this boring Republican government that nobody paid attention to, totally inconsequential, while there were powerful social and economic forces being propelled by the public. Third possibility is you're going to get revolt on steroids. People are going to come out angry. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I can't tell you.
Is there something that we can do on the level of rhetoric and discourse to kind of potentially make a difference in the current state, this current state of non-equilibrium of instability? When I think about myself, I think I do tend towards a little bit of these characteristics of the public, of like a little bit nihilistic, a little bit like I have large expectations of the government that I feel are not achieved. Maybe I am a little bit, spoiled and feel like I deserve certain things. But is there some way of, rather than kind of feeding this nihilistic streak and being so like negative in speech, is there something that can be done in terms of the way we talk about our society that could make a difference, or is that just kind of like a pipe dream?
No, I think there absolutely is. Of course there is. I mean, I think all the powerful tendencies today pull against that. So you are sort of swimming upstream against a powerful current. But it can be done. It can be done. I think we have to watch our words. We have to watch our expectations. We have to, I'll tell you what my method of analysis is. My method of analysis is try and look at a question, an event, a conflict, whatever, from as many possible perspectives as my brain can hold. I mean, it has a limit. I can't do every possible perspective. But for example, when I was at CIA, it was like, okay, if you're Al Qaeda, all right, and CIA had this habit that drove me crazy of calling terrorists the bad guys. Like they woke up every morning saying, what bad thing am I going to do today, right? Well, I mean, when you read their stuff, you realize that they were heroes to themselves. They were noble heroes. I believe they were basically the second coming of the companions of Muhammad. And so if you want to defeat them, calling them the bad guys, forget it. You're never going to get there. But understanding how they think, what their ideas of right and wrong are, how close are they to their own ideas of right and wrong? They were very far off. They said things but did very terrible things. And I think today we're in the same boat. When you talk about Trump, try to understand why somebody would vote Trump, and think of it as a good thing. Think of it as this is a positive step. They're not thinking, I'm telling you, there's a lot of nihilism. They're not thinking, I'm waking up today being a nihilist. I want to do this terrible thing. You want to understand why they do it, and then when you talk, be sympathetic. I always feel like even the elites who drive me a little crazy, they're trying, right? They're trying. We actually could have way worse elites than we have. I have been to many countries where that is the case. I think every American should be given like a 1-year tour, not of the usual touristy places, but of their really, really rotten countries, all right? And you come back thinking, wow, okay, at our worst, we're still so far better than so many other countries, and basically
have some gratitude to and sense of preservation to things that you do have, and not just trying to hurt yourself and your surroundings with what you feel that you're lacking.
Right. I mean, I am sure that both of your lives are very rewarding. You are both probably very educated. You, in the normal time, and we're talking pandemic now, but in a normal time, you could probably get in a car and go somewhere, get in an airplane and fly somewhere. You could obtain information very easily. You go to good restaurants. You have good friends. I mean, the life of an American for the vast majority of us, I'm sure they're at the bottom. That's not the case, but at the bottom, it's better than at the bottom of many other countries. I mean, I lived in Paraguay for 2 years. So look at the things you've got. Look at your personal life. I think what the web does is make you think that politics is like part of your family life. So you're always yelling at the politicians, you know. I mean, you feel about them the way you would feel like if, you know, your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend betrayed you in some way, right? There's this personal feeling. It's not like, now these are people who are out there. How much that Trump did touched you personally? How much? I mean, we got a couple of checks that was like a crazy thing, but I mean, very little from Washington touches the average American. All right. So this is all, you know, a mistaken distance. And I think if we dedicate ourselves more, and Dickens has the phrase telescopic philanthropy, which has a character, one of his best characters, who wants to save the natives in Nigeria, but her children are falling apart and are in peril. So watch the children, watch your family, watch your friends, and invest your emotions in there, and invest your head in trying to make the country better. I mean, that's perfectly okay. But trying to get some sort of emotional buzz, you know, with anger or virtuousness or whatever out of political stands, probably in the end, this environment is very destructive.
The thing that really resonated, well, first of all, you keep saying, you talk about when you look at the other side, or when you look at people who go against the world that you dream about. We should again reiterate that the one value that you do raise is the appreciation of a liberal democracy. So I think you've made the case already, but why liberal democracy? I think I need less convincing than maybe Vanessa, but I'm a conservative in her eyes. So, but I'd love you to make that the strong case for that.
And in the context of our new information age, liberal democracy in an information age.
I mean, guys, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Give me an alternative. I mean, is it the Chinese model is the alternative? I mean, you would have to have the bizarre history that the Chinese Communist Party has had, where it was a totalitarian Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. Then it became kind of like a cowboy capitalist, sort of like authoritarian dictator. Now it's going back a little bit more into more control. I mean, that can't be duplicated. So that's not even a model. There's no model there. They're just an evolution. Putinism, that's just a dictatorship. Latin America was full of those things. They're not very attractive. So what is the alternative to liberal democracy at its most dysfunctional? There are no alternatives. So I think until somebody comes up with an alternative, I mean, in the 20th century, there were many. All right, there were many. My point of pride in the CIA service was, you know, we won the Cold War. And for people today, that seems like, oh yeah, well, that was easy because we were good and they were bad. It was not. Many people in free countries believed that the other system was better. Okay, that doesn't happen anymore. Nobody has an alternative. Lots of people bashing. Nobody's producing alternatives. All right, so I don't have to argue on behalf of liberal democracy because it's the only system standing. Now, what we have to do is make it work a little bit better.
And you did mention history, and the value of having a little more historical perspective in that context, and that's something that again very much resonated with me, because when I get into arguments about those things, I feel that the more you steep yourself in history, the more humbling you find your surroundings and what you do have, and your troubles seem a little more petty compared to the grand sweep of history.
I mean, I think what you described is exactly what I said before. History was my major in school. So, I mean,
Mine too.
I believe that the study of history is exactly what I described before as analysis. Put yourself in the minds of people who are strikingly different from you, and try to figure out why they said the things they said and why they did the things they said. Sometimes they connect with the present, but I think in any case, it's a mind-enlarging exercise, because you are now aware of, if you go to Rome and you stand at the Forum, which I would recommend, it's one of the most beautiful and moving sites ever. But looking at it as a tourist is one thing. Looking at it, understanding what that place was to a Roman, particularly to a Roman aristocrat, it's very moving. It's very moving. You suddenly, I have had a few moments in my life. I love to travel and I love history. When I have what I describe as a feeling of history, and suddenly my eyes get filled with tears, and I'm standing there, and I don't even know what's happening to me, right? And I think it's a very enlarging feeling. And I will add, this part of the sectarian attitude is that history is the history of evil, corruption, and oppression. So it's like a contaminating plague. The farthest away you stay from contact, the better off you are. So part of the sectarian attitude is very, very deeply ignorant of history.
This again throws me back to our conversation with Tom Holland. Before you go, are there any other places that you recognize this type of revolt going on right now? I don't know if you've been following the GameStop saga. As I was reading the headlines this week, I could help but think that this is Martin Gurri's thesis in the realms of the stock exchange. It's sectarians from the border anarchistically fucking with the elites in the center, and those elites shutting them down. So I don't know if you've been paying attention to that, or is there something else that has piqued your interest?
Well, the financial thing is very funny, because I saw that Mark Andreessen was giving me credit for basically having called this, and I'm happy to take all the credit in the world, but I don't know crap about hedge funds or shorting or anything like that. So I think it's in every institution, Adam. I think it's at every institution that we have, it's happening. It's happening, of course, with media. You see that really obviously, but it's happening in the universities. Universities, universities is a medieval institution, all right? In the age of digital information, they're resisting, because they have repurposed themselves as a ticket to, the upper class, the upper middle class. So everybody's, cheating and lying about their children so they can get them into the best schools. But that's a short game. In the end, something drastic is going to happen to the universities. I'm very fascinated as to what that's going to be. The same is true probably of business. There are some businesses that are toying with different structures that are way flatter. I'm also looking for that. Every institution, there really isn't an exception. Every institution we have is a legacy thing. And this tsunami is bashing and battering away at each and every one of them. Different speeds. Probably the media world went down first. The political world went down second. The business world seems to be holding out the most. But maybe this is the beginning for the business world, right? Maybe we're now seeing the start for that. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have a particular place that I'm looking at. I'm a geopolitical analyst, so I guess I'm fixated on that. But I say it everywhere in the book, and I mean it. It's everywhere. This conflict is everywhere.
I love to get in touch with the pessimism of our guests at the end. Where are your feelings about this? What scares you the most? Is it the decline of democracy? Is it the lack of social cohesion? Where are your frets at the moment?
Like I said, I'm a long-term optimist, so that kind of keeps me smiling through the worst of short-term pessimistic times. So, no, I mean, I sleep well at night. I think, we're all working this out together. It's not pleasant. Sometimes, people die, and that's terrible. But we're not at 30-year war level. I mean, all this talk about an American Civil War, I laugh at. Having been born in Latin America, I can smell when things like that are about to happen. We're not anywhere near there, okay? And honestly, we need a lot more young people as opposed to old people to have a civil war. So I think it's the salient fact is turbulence, just terrible turbulence. Some things are very good. I mean, the pandemic has shown this. We couldn't have survived without the web during the pandemic. And I don't just mean that Amazon, it's like Christmas in July. Every day I have a gigantic package in front of my house. I mean that if it weren't for Netflix and Hulu and Crunchyroll and whatnot, I would be going stark raving mad, right? So
if it weren't for Zoom, we wouldn't be able to do this conversation or see any of our friends during this time.
Or work from home. Yeah. I mean, there's a tremendous anti-web feeling right now. I call it the Mubarak switch syndrome. Just turn the damn thing off. But this is like the golden era of the digital, man. I mean, we are surviving because of it.
We're fraying and surviving because of it.
Well, we're fraying because, yes, we were fraying because of all these transitions and changes. But at this particular moment, we're surviving because, right?
Well, Martin,
right.
Your book is fantastic. I recommend it to everyone. And thank you for helping us make sense of things.
Oh, thanks for the nice words.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you, Martin.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We're Uncertain Pod on the socials. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and enemies. Till next time, stay sane.